The Gateway Knob, by Stephen Lake. Rocky slowly walked around his dad's old workshop and studied the multiple shelves of old boxes that were there, some which contained tools, spare parts, trinkets, and other items that his dad had collected over the years. It was hard for Rocky to handle these boxes that had once belonged to his father now that he'd passed away. However, it had to be done. So he did his best to sort through everything. As he did, he pulled a small box off one of the upper shelves in the workshop, and then opened it. Inside it he found several old, rusty locks, an old skeleton key, and an antique doorknob. He was amazed that, despite the sorry condition of the other items in the box, the doorknob looked almost brand new, even though it was clearly from long before the turn of the century. As he stared at it, a memory flashed through his mind. "Hey, John. Come here a second," he said. A tall, middle-aged man appeared from around the corner and approached him. "What is it?" he asked. Rocky held up the doorknob for him to see. "Do you remember this? Grandpa used to have it in his workshop. It was installed on that old wooden door at the back of the storeroom that went nowhere." John nodded. "I remember. He even had windows in that wall. But all of them were covered over with bricks for some reason," he said. Rocky nodded. "Yeah, that happened when that new drugstore moved in behind Grandpa's toy shop. When they put up the new building, they built it right up against the back of his shop, and subsequently covered up the door. Before that there was a narrow alleyway between his place and that old diner they tore down to build the pharmacy. That's why there was a door and windows there, as they were once usable, and opened out into that alleyway." "Yeah, I remember," replied John. Rocky then pulled the doorknob from the box and studied it. "Too bad it's just a doorknob. If we had the entire lock, it would be a nice addition to the hickory doors I put in my study last year." John shrugged. "Why not just keep it and see if you find something to put it on? A doorknob that old, in that good a shape, is hard to come by. Even if you don't, it had a lot of sentimental value to Grandpa, as he once told Dad to protect it with his life, and never give it away. So, now that Dad's gone, I think the task of keeping it safe has fallen to you. So, why don't you take it home and keep it with the other family heirlooms that you've collected?" Rocky pondered this for a moment, and then nodded. "Yeah, I can do that. Especially since it once belonged to Grandpa. Sounds good to me." Rocky then finished helping his brother, and the rest of the family, clean out his dad's old workshop, and other belongings. After this they, in turn, helped his mother settle into her new life as a widow before returning home to their regular daily lives. For several months afterwards the doorknob sat in Rocky's workshop, in the old box it had originally been found in, and patiently waited for a chance to be used. And then one day that opportunity came. While working on a project for the college's astrophysics department, he walked up to the door to his study and turned the handle to enter, only to have the door handle completely crumbled to pieces in his hand. He then held the shattered pieces up to his face and noticed that the ornate wood, that the handle was made of, had dry rotted so badly that it had fallen apart. "I knew I should have stuck with brass handles," he muttered. He then turned and trotted down to his workshop, where he fumbled through dozens of drawers and bins of assorted parts and pieces in search of a replacement. After nearly 20 minutes of fruitless searching, he stopped and rested his hands on his hips. "Don't I have any spare door handles?" he wondered. Just then he remembered the doorknob he'd brought home with him from his dad's old workshop. He quickly reached up on a nearby shelf, took down a small box, and pulled out the doorknob. He then strolled back into the house, and took a few quick seconds to place the doorknob over the old handle post before giving it a firm push to seat it. But, when he did, he heard a soft click, and then a chime. A moment later a small, glowing green square appeared on the door just above the doorknob. Rocky bent down and studied this curiously. In the center of the green square was a dark blue number 1 highlighted in a glowing white aura. He put his hand over the square and discovered that the glowing number was coming from the door itself. "That's odd," he thought as he examined it further. He then reached down and turned the knob to open the door, but heard a click, click, click instead. He again looked at the doorknob curiously, and was surprised to see that the glowing green square had changed. It now contained the number 4. This puzzled him. He knelt down in front of the doorknob and gently turned it to the right. Again it made a clicking sound with the number changing each time it did. Puzzled by this, he fished his reading glasses out of his shirt pocket, pulled the knob off the door, and studied it. However, he could see nothing unusual about it. He then glanced over at the door and noticed that the small green square was gone. He shrugged, put the doorknob back on the post and pressed on it. Again he heard a gentle click, followed by the light green square, and the number 7, reappearing on it. He then turned the knob back to the left out of curiosity and found that the numbers decreased just as expected. So he continued to play with the knob, turning it back and forth as he watched the numbers change in response. This strange doorknob was really starting to both fascinate and alarm him at the same time. He then pressed on the doorknob a second time, thinking that, since the first time had brought about the green box with a number in it, maybe a second time would bring about something different. And it did exactly that. When he pressed on the doorknob this time, the little green box turned a brilliant, fire engine red, and began to blink. Moments later the rush of wind, and the roar of water, began to echo from the other side of the door. Fearing that a pipe had burst, or a window had broken, he turned the doorknob and felt the door pushed back at him by a strong breeze. He pushed harder, but found that the wind was stronger than he could fight against. "Oh great! A storm's come up and it broke out one of my windows," he thought. He eventually flung his entire weight against the door, forcing it open. What he saw on the other side, however, both surprised and confused him. Rather than walking into his study as he'd expected, he instead found himself at the foot of a lighthouse that stood at the edge of a vast, darkened, storm-swept sea. Above this sea hung massive, bluish-gray storm clouds that flickered with powerful and terrifying walls of crimson-red lightning. Off in the distance, amidst the strobe-like flashes of lightning, he could see what looked like a Viking ship bouncing precariously on the terrifying and powerful waves. Confused at seeing this, he took a quick second to look behind himself to be sure he wasn't dreaming, and saw that his house was indeed still there. Yet, despite this, there lay a strange, alien world before him, just beyond the threshold of his door. None of this made any sense to him, and completely defied all logic. "No, this has to be a dream," he thought. But the unmistakable taste of salt in the air, and the smell of the sea, told him otherwise. He then looked down and noticed that there was a light brown substance just beyond the door that looked like sand. Curious, he reached down and scooped up a handful of it. It was cold, and wet, and definitely sand. As he tried to make sense of it all, logic gave way to panic. He then grabbed the door, and with all his strength, slammed it shut. Moments later the sound of the wind vanished and the little red blinking square on the door turned back to a steady light green again. As he stood there in the hallway, he breathed rapidly as he tried to get his wits about him again. What was it that he'd just experienced? None of it made any sense. "I've got to be seeing things," he thought as he breathed heavily. Slowly he brought his fear under control as he allowed logic to once more rule his mind. He then looked down at the doorknob again and studied it with perplexity. After several moments he took a deep breath, and turned the knob to the right again, continuing to do so until it stopped at 26. He tried turning it further, but it wouldn't go. He then pressed on the doorknob and watched as the green-colored square turned bright red and began blinking again. This time the sounds of human activity, and the clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobbled streets, trickled through the door. A thin veil of brilliant sunlight peeked through the edges of the door frame. Curious to what was there now, he slowly and cautiously turned the knob, and then opened the door. As he did, he found an old, medieval-style cobblestone street just beyond. It was lined with many colorful and strangely designed buildings that were accented with brilliantly colored banners which hung from nearly every window. Even the people themselves were dressed in a multitude of colors, like jesters preparing to entertain a king. He cautiously stepped through the doorway and studied the city around him. At first nobody paid any attention to him. However, anyone dressed in a tailor-fit, charcoal gray business suit in a city filled with color is hard to ignore. After a few moments the entire city seemed to grind to a halt as they all stopped and stared at him in shocked disbelief. One man then began shouting at him in a language that Rocky didn't recognize. Two more soon joined him. Eventually the whole street erupted in anger at his striking lack of colors, causing many to march towards him with fists raised in protest. Rocky quickly realized that something wasn't right and immediately retreated through the door, slamming it shut behind him. Again the color of the square on the door changed from red to green. Wherever that had been, the citizens there definitely didn't like people who weren't colorful. Deciding to explore further, and more thoroughly, he turned the knob until the number 1 appeared on the door. He again pressed it in, and then opened the door. However, what greeted him on the other side both surprised and terrified him. Staring at him, as if in equal confusion, was the massive face of a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Rocky gulped nervously as the T-Rex briefly sniffed at him, and then backed up as though preparing itself to snatch an easy snack. Rocky immediately slammed the door shut and pulled back on the knob. Nope, definitely not going there, he thought. He then clicked the knob over to the number 2, and pressed it in. The smell of a city filled with horse manure and 1,000 coal fires wafted through the door. Curious, he opened the door and found that it opened out into a city, bathed in night, that looked strikingly like London from the mid-1800s. This included horses and carriages traveling up and down the streets via gaslight and oil lanterns as citizens slowly moved about amidst a smoky gray blizzard that covered them in a thick layer of soot-stained snow. However, the faces that he saw on the people that were there were anything but human. In fact, they looked almost trollish, as though ripped out of a classic fantasy novel. He soon closed the door, clicked the knob to the number 3 position, and then opened it again. This time he found himself standing in a glistening white starport that floated in the blackness of space near a brilliant, fiery sun that flashed and flared like an angry blue marble. Standing before him in the room was a smattering of people, each seemingly from a different race, with some in space suits, some in strange-looking clothes, and others in little more than their native fur. Wherever this was, it definitely wasn't either Earth, nor Kansas. Deciding to explore further, he closed the door again, clicked the knob to the next number, and began to press it in again. However, just as he did, he suddenly felt as though something had hit him. His world immediately sank into darkness as he crumbled to the floor. The next thing he knew his housekeeper was shaking him vigorously as she tried to rouse him. "Doctor, wake up. You'll be late for your classes," she said. Rocky opened his eyes and was surprised to find himself sitting in his study as the light of the mid-morning sun streamed through the windows. He adjusted himself in his chair, and then felt a book tumble from his lap. Looking down at the title he realized that it had been the one he'd come for the previous night. As he tried to get up, his head began to throb. He winced at the pain. "Can I get you anything?" asked the housekeeper. "Some tea and an aspirin, please," said Rocky. The housekeeper quickly slipped away to retrieve the requested items. As he waited, he glanced at his watch and was surprised at the time. When the housekeeper returned, he quickly gulped down the tea and aspirin, and then hurried out of the house. Later that day, after class, as Rocky was sitting in the faculty lounge pondering what he had seen the night before, a fellow teacher came over and sat down next to him. "Afternoon, Professor," said the man in a light and jubilant tone. Rocky nodded slowly as his mind was preoccupied with other things. "Something on your mind?" asked the man. Rocky took a deep breath and then began to expound to the man everything he'd seen the previous night. Eventually he finished, causing the man to laugh and shake his head. "Sounds like you were having quite a dream last night," he said. Rocky shook his head. "That's just it. I don't think it was a dream. It felt very real, and I remember every detail of it. Come now, doctor. What you're telling me sounds more like magic than reality. No doorknob can just open gateways to other worlds." "So you were obviously dreaming," said the man. Rocky frowned at him. "I know what I saw. If you don't believe me, I can show you later tonight at my house," he said. The man smiled. "Sounds good to me." Rocky nodded. "I look forward to it. But, Until then, I've got a class to teach. So, for now, I bid you good day." The man then smiled as Rocky got up and strode out of the room. Moments later another man strode up behind him. "Did you get the knob?" asked the second man. The first man smiled, and held up the antique doorknob. "Oh, don't worry, I got it. I even made sure to replace it with an identical, yet inert copy of his old one so that he wouldn't know it was gone." "That's good. However, I'm worried about him." "Does he still believe that what he saw was real?" asked the second man. The first man frowned slightly. "Unfortunately, he does. However, even if he does tell others about what he saw, nobody's going to believe him. So I think it's safe to just leave things as they are." "I sure hope so," said the second man. He then laughed, and said, "That now makes me think of what Arthur C. Clarke once said, that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Given how advanced our technology is, I believe it appeared as pure magic to the doctor last night, which is likely why he couldn't make sense of what he saw." The first man grinned. "Indeed it did. And I hope he enjoyed it, too, as it's always quite an experience." The end.